When one thinks of the genre of horror, the first thing that comes to mind is the campy slasher films of the 70s, filled with the brutal killings of teenagers. Or maybe the cult-themed movies like Midsommar or Rosemary's Baby, that brainwash the viewer as well as the protagonist. But there is a connection between all subgenres of horror, and that is the final girl trope. From Ripley in Alien to Laurie Strode in Halloween to Sidney Prescott in Scream. This trope has stood the test of time and has been remastered in many ways. But is this trope a product of the male gaze, seeped in the misogyny of the 60s and 70s? Or is it an early product of the feminist movement meant to show women as people rather than objects? What is a final girl? First, let's define what makes a final girl. This trope refers to the last woman/girl alive to defeat the slasher. Alternatively, it is the last person to tell the story. When it comes to older movies and TV shows, this girl is typically a virgin and more book smart than her peers, those of who usually end up splattered against the walls at the face of a homicidal maniac in a demented mask. Film theorist Carol J. Clover, the first person to coin the term final girl, says in her book Men, Women, and Chainsaws, she is one who encounters the mutilated bodies of her friends and perceives the full extent of the preceding horror and her own peril. Who is cornered, wounded, whom we see scream, stagger, fall, rise, and scream again. She is abject terror personified. While this book may have been written in the 1990s, specifically 1992, we've had the final girl since the dawn of horror. For many, the final girl is the embodiment of restricting conservative views of what women should be, virginal, submissive, untouched by the menace that is the outside world. But as this trope has evolved, many have taken notice that through this device, the men of the audience are forced to identify with the women in the climax of the movie. It has allowed for new points of view of storytelling when the women win, they are able to force the men to watch them step into their own power. Of course, this is a movie-to-movie basis, so let's view some examples. In a renaissance of slasher movies, we were treated to famous characters such as Sidney Prescott from Scream, and now we have the likes of Tree Gelbman from Happy Death Day. The first final girl I would like to take a look at is Jess Bradman from the 1974 movie Black Christmas. It's Christmas break and a group of sorority sisters make plans for the holidays, but when strange anonymous phone calls are beginning to put them on edge, one of the sisters, Claire, disappears. They contact the police, who don't express as much concern. Meanwhile, Jess, our main character, is planning on getting an abortion, which her boyfriend Peter is very much against. The police finally start getting concerned whenever a 13-year-old is found dead in the park. They set up a wiretap at the sorority house, but is it too late? Who knows? This movie is influential for many reasons, as it, along with the more popular movie that came out only 2 months earlier, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, were the dawn of a new era for horror movies. See, these two films became the first real example of the slasher subgenre, one that has become notorious for its objectification of women in its cast. Now, while Jess is one of the earliest examples of final girl, she doesn't fit the mold we know today. As mentioned in the summary, she is far from virginal. Her subplot throughout the film is between her and her boyfriend Peter. She's pregnant with his child and doesn't want to carry it to term, instead choosing to have an abortion. This subplot not only gives the movie a reason to suspect Peter as the killer due to his violent reaction to the news, but also presents this in a non-harmful light, painting Peter as the bad one for not letting Jess have her bodily autonomy. This is not only incredibly influential, as abortion had only been legalized in Canada, the country that this movie came out in 1996, but it also showed the main character having agency. Now, despite all of this, Jess does fall into the tropes of the genre, being in a way more pure than her sorority sisters who are often smoking and drinking throughout the movie. She's still used as a passive, innocent character to contrast a killer who makes blatantly obscene noises that I cannot repeat in a school project. Now, the final girl trope wouldn't be fully cemented until the famous 1978 film Halloween came out, and the world was given Laurie Strode, and how blessed we all were because of that. Laurie is a definition of a final girl. She's a helpless victim who in the climax of the movie fights back. She's clever and resourceful, but she falls into the outdated pitfalls of the final girl. See, while Laurie was doing her job as a babysitter on the titular Halloween night, her friends were getting killed by the Shape of Haddonfield because they were too distracted by the prospect of promiscuity. It's stated early in the film that Laurie is more conservative whenever it comes to the idea of dating, and is what we would call a prude. Now, on its own, this isn't a bad thing. If anyone doesn't want to do that, they shouldn't be forced to. But combined with the fact that everyone who has died in that movie was very into that scene, I'm sure you can see what kind of an awful picture this paints. This only helps spread the lies of purity culture and sets in the fact that if you don't act on these desires, bad things will happen to you. The way purity culture and horror movies portray this makes it seem like it's something to be afraid of, and not that it's just something natural for most of us. But that was the 70s, right? It's not a true representation of what the trope is like today. Horror was a film genre based on formulas. It wasn't long before The Final Girl became one of those as well. Wes Craven offered a meta-commentary on the tropes he helped establish in films like A Nightmare on Elm Street in 1996's Scream. This film sets up our titular protagonist, Sidney Prescott, to be your typical horror movie final girl. She's sweet and chaste and makes a direct comparison on how she's not like your other typical horror movie victims. Throughout the movie, though, we see she's not as demure as she's first depicted and may not be as innocent either. The film goes as far to take away her perceived purity in a scene between her and her boyfriend, Billy Loomis. Sydney is a new type of final girl, a strong one who is in complete control of her surroundings, knowing the rules of horror, allowing her to bend them. Like all good horror movies, Scream inspired its own imitations wanting to piggyback off of this new kind of final girl. Films like Cabin in the Woods and The Final Girls inquire similar questions as to why these tropes persist and how we can bend them to make them something new or revel in them. More importantly, Sydney ushered in a new era for the final girl, one where she doesn't just survive, but thrives afterwards. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, both the movie and TV show, pushed this idea even further by making the protagonist a blonde and unabashedly feminine cheerleader, the opposite of the virginal tomboy we're used to. Buffy is not only defending herself from the monsters, but also goes out and hunts them. You can see this newfound power in newer horror movies, where the final girl no longer hides from the danger, but chooses to run towards it. Even in more recent horror movies, they take this a step further by giving us final girls who are not only stronger, but in more control than us or they know, making us question our gender-based biases towards this genre. Ari Aster's hit film Midsommar gave us Dani, who seems like our typical final girl. She's isolated from the rest of the cast, who would rather do drugs and get it on, and they all meet the deadly fates we'd expect. Dani also fits the role as the active investigating gaze. She's the only one who suspects there's something wrong. Yet that's not it for her. In becoming the final girl, she takes back the power that her abusive boyfriend has stolen from her and gets revenge, putting her in an interesting scenario where she's not only the final girl, but she doesn't get the happy ending we'd expect. Sure, her boyfriend and his jerk friends are off, but at what cost? Without delving into the spoilers for the movie, at the end, Dani has put herself in a scenario where she's still stuck with the cult. But maybe that's her happy ending. While to us it may be a bittersweet one, to her it may be true freedom. Who knows? Beyond giving us a meta-commentary on the tropes we're used to, this new era of the final girl has given us something the 70s and 80s didn't. Final girls with power and control. The final girls in It Follow and The Witch don't triumph because they're virgins. They triumph because they use their sexuality. In It Follows, the final girl is hunted by basically a demonic STD. Yet instead of defeating it by shedding her desires, she weaponizes them to free herself from it. Thomasin in Robert Eggers' The Witch is a naive teenage girl raised in an extremely Protestant household repressed by her strict 17th century society. In light of her blossoming sexuality, her family treats her as a villain until eventually she gives in and becomes one. This allows her to gain full agency rather than the phallic final girls of the past. The modern final girl embraces her sexuality rather than represses it. A feminist update on the rather outdated ideals of this trope. While the newer final girls may have more agency and control, they are still confined by one trapping. They're almost always white. Alfred Hitchcock himself once coined, blondes make the best victims. They're like virgin snow that shows up the bloody footprints. As this idea persists into more modern and aware movies of today, filmmakers still rely on us feeling empathy for the white protagonist while treating minority characters as if they're disposable. The opposite of the final girl trope is the black guy dies first, after all. While the audience is supposed to feel terrified for the white girls, the death of the other POC are treated as part of the show. As nerdist Tai Gooden phrased it, Black women and girls weren't perceived as vulnerable women who an audience could identify with as victims of violence because we were barely seen as people at all, much less valuable ones. The settings of horror movies often reflect this as well, taking place in suburban high schools and communities often perceived as idyllic with the perfect lives, these of which are often lily white. Showing terror invade this community when it's not supposed to happen here. Horror films often depict violence against black people as commonplace, and black girls are never there to be the final girl. She's at best the almost final girl, who's more than likely a friend of the real protagonist. She's there to offer support and common sense before inevitably getting killed off to teach the final girl a lesson. The recent rise in what has been dubbed social horror is challenging this and giving a more intersectional feminist perspective on this trope. Kimberlé Crenshaw, an American professor who coined the term back in 1989, explained intersectional feminism as a prism for seeing the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exacerbate each other. In an interview with Time magazine, in Jordan Peele's hit movie Us, this trope is specifically challenged by the main character Adelaide Wilson, who is given all control and power of the more modern final girl. But she is the rare black final girl, one who has been assimilated into white society through her wealth. That comfort is threatened by a mysterious and murderous other. It highlights how much Adelaide has participated in creating the horror she is now faced with. And with the final twist of the movie, we are then challenged in the fact that she is both villain and victim, monster and final girl. It makes us question who to side with, and because we are forced to fear and empathize with her, it truly makes us fear the movie's social horror. The terror of this film and other similar ones like Assassination Nation are systemic and affecting more than just one kind of girl, and they take more than one kind of final girl to defeat them. Even as the final girl has evolved, it is still rooted in ideas of how women should be, pure, innocent, a waiting vessel for the violence the world will inflict on them. And unfortunately, the final girl trope is still relevant today because violence is so rampantly inflicted on women. But where the former final girls were defined by their victimization, the modern spin on this trope is more human. Whereas the 70s and 80s final girls were just surviving, the 90s to today final girls, they are thriving. Tellingly, the 2018 sequel to Halloween, Laurie Strode is no longer just cowering, but she is a warrior ready to fight Michael Myers and take him down once and for all. The terrors the final girl faced haven't subsided, but she'll now face them with more confidence and control.